In the early hours of a February morning, while most of the world slept, someone was moving money. Not in armored trucks, not with guns, but with keystrokes. $100 million, transferred silently, invisibly, in under 10 minutes, from one of the most trusted financial institutions on the planet, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. The attackers had been inside the system for weeks. They had studied it, learned it, breathed inside it like ghosts who had lived in the walls for years. And when the moment came, they didn't hesitate. But here is the question that investigators would spend years trying to answer. Who were they? A criminal gang? A rogue collective? A private mercenary unit? No. They were soldiers. State-sponsored, government-funded, unleashed. And they came from a country the world had almost dismissed entirely. North Korea. A nation of 25 million people, largely cut off from the global internet. A country where outside information is treated as a national security threat. Where civilians have no access to the web. Where the digital world, for most people, simply does not exist. And yet, from within those borders, some of the most sophisticated cyber attacks in human history have been launched. The Lazarus Group. That is the name intelligence agencies, cybersecurity firms, and governments around the world would come to use for North Korea's elite hacking apparatus. The name itself is deliberate, borrowed from the biblical figure who rose from the dead. Because no matter how many times the world believed it had contained them, disrupted them, or exposed them, they came back. The group's origins trace back to the early 2000s, within the Korean People's Army's Cyber Warfare Division, Unit 121. By the mid-2000s, North Korea had made a strategic decision that would change the geopolitical landscape of cyber conflict forever. They understood something most nations hadn't yet grasped. Cyber attacks were not just weapons of disruption. They were tools of revenue. A nation under the most severe international sanctions in the world, cut off from oil, technology, financial systems, and trade, could, in theory, steal its way to survival. Through a keyboard from anywhere on the planet. Before Lazarus had a name, it had a proving ground. In 2009, a wave of distributed denial-of-service attacks, crude by comparison to what would come later, knocked government and financial websites offline across the United States and South Korea. The attacks flooded servers with junk traffic until they collapsed under their own weight. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't quiet. But it was a test. Researchers who later dissected the malware, tracked under the codename Operation Troy, found overlapping code, shared infrastructure, digital fingerprints that would resurface again and again in the years that followed, a signature the world hadn't yet learned to recognize. Lazarus operatives would not work from inside North Korea. That would be too easy to trace. Instead, they operated out of satellite offices, Shenyang and Dalian in China, Malaysia, Thailand, and in Indonesia. Young, technically brilliant North Koreans, handpicked from elite universities in Pyongyang, sent abroad under cover of IT contractors, software developers, and freelance programmers. They lived double lives, mundane by day and devastating by night. To understand what made Lazarus so dangerous, you need to understand something about how they operated, because it wasn't chaos. It wasn't random. It was patient, methodical, and almost clinical. The group's methodology typically followed a pattern that cybersecurity researchers would later call living off the land. They didn't announce themselves with loud, blunt attacks. They entered quietly, they observed. They mapped internal networks, learned the language of the systems they were inside, and then, only when fully prepared, they struck. Their first major brush with global attention came in 2014. The target, Sony Pictures Entertainment. Sony had been preparing to release a comedy film named as The Interview, a satirical movie depicting the fictional assassination of North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. The regime was incensed. They had demanded the film be pulled. But Sony refused. Then, in November of 2014, Sony's entire internal network collapsed. Employees arrived at work to find their computers displaying a leering red skull. A message from a group calling themselves Guardians of Peace. Terabytes of internal data, unreleased films, executive emails, salary records, employee social security numbers, private scripts, were dumped onto the internet. The personal, the confidential, the embarrassing. All of it gone. The FBI would later formally attribute the attack to North Korea. The scale of destruction was unlike anything a corporation had experienced from a state actor before. It wasn't espionage, it wasn't intelligence gathering. It was humiliation as a weapon. But Sony, in retrospect, was just a warning shot. What came next was something far more ambitious. Something that would redefine what a cyber attack could accomplish financially. Back to February 2016, the Bangladesh Bank heist. The Bangladesh Bank held reserve funds at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, a common arrangement for smaller national banks. The Lazarus Group had spent months inside Bangladesh bank systems, studying exactly how SWIFT worked, the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication. SWIFT was the backbone of global financial transfers. The language banks used to speak to each other, and Lazarus had learned it fluently. They sent fraudulent SWIFT messages to the Federal Reserve, requesting transfers totaling nearly $1 billion, routed to accounts in the Philippines, Sri Lanka, and beyond. The Fed processed many of them without suspicion. $35 million landed in Sri Lanka. $81 million flowed into casino accounts in Manila, jurisdictions where anti-money laundering laws were weaker, where cash could be laundered through gaming tables and withdrawn almost invisibly. $1 billion. The plan nearly worked in full. What stopped it? A typo. A single misspelling in one of the transfer instructions, foundation instead of foundation, flagged by a routing bank in Germany. That one word triggered a manual review. The remaining transfers were frozen. But $81 million had already disappeared. It remains one of the largest cyber heists in history. And it was only the beginning of Lazarus's financial campaign. May 12, 2017. WannaCry. At 7 a.m. that morning, a NHS hospital in the United Kingdom received a notification, then another. Computers across the entire healthcare system began locking themselves, screens went red. A ransom demand appeared, pay in Bitcoin or lose your files permanently. Within hours, WannaCry had spread to over 150 countries, 200,000 computers. Hospitals, banks, telecoms, government systems, all locked. In the UK's National Health Service, operations were cancelled, ambulances were diverted. Patients in critical condition had to be redirected because the systems their doctors depended on were frozen. People could have died, people's lives were placed in real, documented danger. WannaCry exploited a vulnerability in Windows systems, a tool originally developed by the U.S. National Security Agency and later leaked online. The Lazarus Group had taken that tool, adapted it, and turned it into a weapon of mass disruption. The financial damage globally, an estimated $4 to $8 billion. The attack was eventually halted, not by a government response, but by a 22-year-old British security researcher named Marcus Hutchins, who accidentally found a kill switch embedded in the malware's code, an unregistered domain that, when activated, caused the ransomware to stop spreading. He registered it for $10.96 and temporarily stopped one of the most destructive cyber attacks in history. But WannaCry taught Pyongyang a lesson too. Disruption made headlines. It didn't fill a treasury. The next chapter of this story wouldn't be written in ransom notes. It would be written on the blockchain.